Hi, I'm Eric Howald here with the Keizer Oral History Project, and today we're speaking with Jan Stewart, a longtime Keizer resident, and she moved here in 1933 at the age of 7. So she has lots of stories to tell, so we'll get to it. So Jan, tell me a little bit about what brought you to Keizer originally.
Well, it was Depression years then, and my family wanted to be able to grow their food and their meat and eggs and all of that sort of thing, so they moved from in-town Salem out to a 10-acre plot on Spong's Landing Road, which is now 22nd Avenue North.
Yeah. So what was it like? How big was your property, and what was it like living along the river right there?
Well, we didn't have any great problems with the river except for an occasional flood, like once every 25 years or so. But it was very pleasant. It was a dead-end road, and there were very compatible neighbors. And there were about 15 youngsters of school age there, and we were all pretty good friends. We all looked out for each other. I was the youngest of the bunch, so they all told me I was the baby, and everyone told me what to do. That was all right. They kept me alive in spite of the time we spent in the river. Oh yes, we spent much time in the river. That was Depression years. We all wanted to earn enough money that we could spend as we wanted, because Mother and Dad during the Depression years were pretty tight with what they would allow us to frivol us away, you know.
Yeah.
And so we would get up early in the morning, perhaps as early as 4 o'clock, pick our quota of berries or whatever it was, beans or prunes or whatever was around to earn the few dollars. And then from 1 o'clock until 6 o'clock, we would be in the river, filthy as it was. How we survived, I cannot explain. But it was absolutely filthy, and we would be in the water from 1 o'clock to 6 o'clock, not on the beach, not sitting there getting a suntan, but we were splashing each other and jumping up on the log rafts that used to float up and down the river, and things like that. Every once in a while, there would be an old river steamer come up. That was when Salem navigation was really navigation. And these big river steamers would come up, and we would hear them coming from way upriver. So we would start swimming out to the middle of the river, and by the time we got to the middle, the steamers would be there. Once in a long time, they would let us get on board, but not very often. Usually the main reason we did that was to get out to where the steamers were and then float back to shore on these huge waves. That was a lot of fun.
Wow.
Those waves were probably 12 to 15 feet high.
Wow. So what kind of, you said there were steamer ships, and so, you know, this is taking quite a ways back in the Keizer history now. What was the town like at that point in time?
Oh,
was it a town?
No, there wasn't any town. There was a school at the corner, the big 4 or 8 grade school in 4 classrooms, was right at the corner of River and Shauver roads. And that was the extent of the town. There was one grocery store on the southwest corner of that intersection, and there were no other businesses. Most of it was rural. There would be 2 or 3 blocks between houses. The roads were not anywhere near like they are now, and our Spong's Landing Road was merely a glorified cow trail. It wasn't paved. It did have a little gravel now and then, but not consistently.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the grocery store that was there. Was it kind of like the old model general stores that we see in Western Frontier kind of stuff?
Yes, and they ran credit tabs for many, many people in Keizer then. I hope they got it all collected someday.
Do you remember the name by chance?
The name Ward Russell comes back to me.
Ward Russell.
Yeah.
All right. So you said you would go out and pick crops and berries and things in the morning to earn money to get the things that you wanted that were the special items. What kind of things were you saving up for, and what was a special item then?
Well, let's see. We would occasionally want to buy a record because we would hear these records on the radio. Naturally, there was no television then. We were all very fond radio fans, and we all had our favorite stations. And we would want to buy a record, or we'd want to buy a magazine or something like that, but that would be about it. Special clothing, maybe.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, do you happen to remember how much something like that would have cost back then, a record or a magazine?
Oh, I think a record would cost less than $1.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Wow. Um, so tell us a little bit about getting around town, or the town as it was back then, to the store. How would you get there?
Well, the neighbors were very cooperative. And as I said, this was Depression times. So when one person drove that 3 miles up to the store, they would often combine trips with other people. We would let each neighbor know, next time you go to the store, can I go along? And so it would take a car full up to the store. We were economizing on gas then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What
And
kind
gas,
of? Go
gas
ahead.
itself cost about 17 cents a gallon.
What oh shoot. What kind of car? That was where I was going with
Oh,
it. What kind of car did you have?
We had an old top-heavy square Model T,
Yeah.
and it was an amazing car. We could pile a whole bunch of kids in the back seat and go to a football game. At that time, my brother was allowed to drive. I wasn't for many years afterwards. Girls don't do things like that, you know. But Mother and Dad felt luxurious as everything when they could acquire a 1930 Essex sedan.
Wow.
And anybody who had a sedan was pretty lucky.
Yeah.
I remember the first car my husband and I bought when we were, let's see, this was probably 1945, 46, was a Model A sedan. No, Model A coupe, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's see. So what was Keizer School like back then? I think it was still 1st through 8th grade at that point.
Yes, it
How
was.
was it? How did you connect with other kids who didn't necessarily live out in the Spong's Landing area?
Oh, that was not hard to do at all. We had 1st and 2nd grades in one room led by Mrs. Bernice Gwynn. She was a neat teacher, and I joined that group in the middle of the 2nd grade. And we had a great time there. The 1st grade would end up sitting idly or doing their assigned projects while the 2nd grade was being instructed. So, of course, if we got bored, we'd drift over and listen to whatever the 2nd grade was learning, which gave us a step up, you know. Then the 3rd and 4th grades did the same thing under Mrs. Perdue, and the 5th and 6th grades had the same sort of setup under Eva Kelso, and the 7th and 8th grades were under Mildred Kirk.
Wow.
And they would have, every now and then, I don't know that it happened every month, but every now and then they would have what they called a community club meeting, where all the parents would come in and discuss things about the school or whatever else was going on. They'd have a little entertainment of some sort, either talented children performing, or often my dad and another man, Truman Cummings, were asked to sing. That's another thought that came up. My dad, during those Depression years, could not afford entertainment, so he made his entertainment by teaching the kids in our area. Now, I don't mean kids, I mean just the boys. Women were not allowed in that. But he taught them all to sing barbershop harmony. And I grew up with barbershop quartets on my front porch every Sunday night. And now when I hear a barbershop chorus perform, it's like sitting in my daddy's lap again.
That's amazing and incredible. Tell me a little bit about, you have so many, it's amazing the grasp you have on the teachers who were in that school and in the small community feel that, still a lot of people say pervades the town now. What were some of the issues facing the school that they discussed? You mentioned the bus transportation was a good one. I'd like to hear that story.
Oh, yes, it was a good one. There was a lot of concern about the cost of buses. Were they really necessary? It was healthful for kids to walk to school, of course. And they finally did get the buses, but no one who lived within, I'm sure, a mile, maybe a mile and a half, was allowed to use the buses. They were just for kids who had a real distance to walk. And of course, there were lots of friendships formed as we walked to school. I didn't walk very much because after that first year, they did have the buses, and there were friendships formed on the buses. But we learned to integrate ourselves into a larger age span then, because the buses held grade school kids and high school kids and that sort of thing.
Where did high school kids go to? They were in
They went into Salem High. There was only one high school in Salem then.
Tell me about, there was a big decision involving getting the buses and how they were going to be utilized given the stress of the times and the Depression. Tell me how, what the compromise that one person proposed was.
Oh, well, there was one very thrifty board member, and he just really questioned whether we really needed to provide buses. And he was finally convinced that we did, but his proposal was that they would go out and pick up the kids who lived more than 3 miles away, bring them into the 3-mile limit, then drop them off and let them walk the rest of the way.
Out of curiosity, you may not remember this. Would the bus then just continue to go back to the school without the kids after they got them?
They never actually put that into effect,
No,
so I don't know.
It's just like a fascinating line to draw in the sand.
That was his proposal. And he was very concerned about spending taxpayer money, bless his heart.
Yeah, a good steward of the money, right? So what kind of things did you have on your farm? I mean, was it primarily, were you using it to grow your own crops, or did you have animals there? What was it?
Well, yes, we had animals that we would need to provide for our own food. We always had 1 or 2 cows and a pig or 2, chickens. And I think that's about the limit of what we grew on the farm. But in those days, we cured our own meats and that sort of thing. We cleared the land to begin with. Mm-hmm. My brother and I had the delightful assignment of picking up the large chunks of wood that resulted from blasting the stumps of the trees that Dad and Grandpa had cut down. And it was hard work, but it was worth it. You know, we were developing the farm. When Dad had a newly cleared field, he would almost always plant potatoes in it. And he sold those potatoes for $1 a big gunny sack full. I'm not sure whether those gunny sacks held 50 or 100 pounds, but I think 100.
Wow.
And it was $1 a bag.
On the topic of your farm, what were the challenges building up a farm at that time? I mean, obviously, you said that the floods would provide good topsoil for the area.
Oh, they did that.
But what were the other challenges that you guys faced out there?
Well, mainly economic. Mm-hmm. But Dad was pretty canny about it. He knew how to find out what would sell and contract with the canneries to grow what would sell. And he started out with row crops, grew a lot of carrots, which would grow to be huge, big carrots, as big as watermelon, almost.
Wow. Big
carrots, but they were used for stock feed. Cows that ate carrots would give creamy colored milk. And of course the milk would be healthful as anything could be with all those veggies in it.
Right, right. So how did you move to the area when you were 7?
Yes.
And before we started this interview, you told me you knew some of the history of the area about Captain Spong.
Oh, yes.
Who had to be rescued from a big flood out there back maybe in the 1880s, we think.
Yeah,
so
late
tell me that story
1800s.
again. I have another question about that. But tell us the story.
Well, this Captain Spong house was right on the riverbank, on the top of the riverbank, which was, well, I don't know, 30, 40 feet over the level of the river now. So here it was that far above just to get into the house. The house itself had tall ceilings, at least 12-foot ceilings. It was a very old house. And Captain Spong had run a ferry service. And when we moved there, those ferry landings were still, pilings were still in place. But nevertheless, during that bad flood in the late 1800s, he reportedly evacuated his wife out of a second-floor bedroom window.
Amazing.
That water was deep.
Right. So how did you hear that story? How did the community kind of preserve their own history with things like that? Was it just stuff you heard around the table?
It was just heard from other people who'd lived there longer than we did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they were welcoming into the fold, so to speak. With
yes.
That sort of thing.
Oh, we had a great sense of community then. Another interesting thing was there were probably 10 or 12 families, no, maybe not that many, 10 probably, up and down that dead-end road. Depression years, we all worked together, And whenever one family would butcher, they would take a package of fresh meat down to each other family in the neighborhood, knowing that when that family butchered, they would do the same.
Wow. So you picked berries when you were younger to earn money for
yes.
those special things. As you grew, what other sorts of jobs did you do? Were you expected to have a job, and how did that?
Not until I got out of high school.
Yeah.
Yeah. That last year of high school, I did work in the cannery. Of course, that was 1943 by that time.
Uh-huh.
And it was wartime, and everybody was expected to work. So I did work in the canneries, and canneries were the big occupation for most of the people then. And canneries and that horrendous paper mill that used to be in downtown Salem.
So, were the cannery, like the canneries I know of are usually north of town right now. Was that where they were now?
No, they were downtown.
Downtown.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, not like Statesman and Liberty Street, but they were, oh goodness, Shipping Street and Front Street.
Yeah.
And the paper mill, of course, was where you can still see the remnants.
Right.
And there was another cannery over on 12th Street. That one was a major cannery, too.
So when did the city really start, or the town
The
back
Keizer?
then? When did it really start changing? How did you kind of see it growing over the years?
Well, in 1954, the businessmen formed what they called the Keizer Merchants Association. At that point, I was covering Keizer for the Statesman Journal as a reporter.
Oh, really?
And that was heaven-sent job. I have a natural curiosity, and I got to ask all the nosy questions. And they had suggested that perhaps I could take on the secretary duties for the Keizer Merchants Association, which I did for a number of years. I don't recall how many, but it was an interesting thing. And that seemed to be the nucleus of the group. And I think it was probably in the early 60s, it was made known that they were going to be developing McNary Country Club. The sponsors of the club had asked me if I would circulate a petition. I declined a petition because I didn't think that would give me an opportunity to air both sides of the story, and I asked if I could take a survey instead. Well, of course, there were many people who opposed the idea of any liquor license in Keizer. They had heard some exaggerated stories about what could happen, and they believed every one of them. So there was a lot of opposition. But when I did this survey, I just asked people carefully so that I wouldn't sway their judgment. I asked them how they felt about having a liquor license in Keizer. And I found that 86% of the people favored it. That seemed to be a deciding factor.
Wow.
They had me testify to that in front of the Liquor Control Commission.
Wow.
And they granted the license.
That's incredible. So how did you end up working for newspapers then? Tell me, like, what happened after high school, and how did the Statesman Journal job come around?
Well, my parents were very good at being parents. They insisted my brother and I have a large vocabulary and that we learned how to spell correctly. I think that was my biggest asset. I was typing manuscripts for anybody who wanted a manuscript, and one of them happened to be a Statesman Journal reporter, and she knew of an opening in Keizer. Wow. So she recommended me for it, and I enjoyed it immensely.
Were there many female reporters back then? So you said there's been about 1950-ish.
Yes.
So
early years of 1950. And yes, many of the stringers, as we were called, correspondents, were women.
Right. So usually looking through a journalist lens gives you a little bit different picture of the community. Sure. How did it change your perspective on what was happening in the area?
It opened my mind widely.
Yeah.
At that point, Governor Sprague was the publisher, and he was a stickler for putting good balance in any news story. If we voiced one side, we had to also voice the other side so that the readers would be concluding the message of it rather than we. And it made me curious, even more curious about everything.
Yeah.
And it was a delight getting to ask all the nosy questions.
Cool. So how long did you work as a stringer, or did that role ever kind of expand for you?
1954 to 1968.
Wow. So what was your favorite stories that you covered in that time? Obviously, the liquor license thing was a big one.
Oh, yes.
But what are some other ones that you got to cover in the Keizer area that you remember, if there are any?
Well, let's see. One of my favorites was when President Nixon came through and held a public meeting, I think in McNary High School, I'm not sure. Anyway, Clarence Seitz was running the newspaper, the Keizer newspaper, called Keizer News, I think, or Keizer Times. And I had come in early, and I was seated on bleachers way up high. He came in later and was down at floor level, and he was trying to get a picture to run in his paper. Well, we were pretty cooperative people, so I called down to him and said, "Throw me your camera, I'll take the picture from up here." He tossed that outrageously expensive camera up to me over the bleachers, you know. Thank God I caught it. And I shot the picture, held it up over my head. And it was a great picture with a few balloons at the lower part and Nixon and Mrs. Nixon in the background at the microphone. And that was what he ran in his paper the next day.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah.
So how you said the Keizer merchant thing was kind of maybe the kind of impetus for even more change in the Keizer
yes.
area. What sort of merchants were around at that point in time? I'm assuming it was more than just a grocery store.
Oh, yeah.
But
Yeah,
how did business contribute to the growth of the area?
Oh, my goodness. In every possible way. Sam Orcutt was one of the greatest. He ran the best grocery store ever and was a big contributor for whatever was going on in a civic manner. And Ray Boucher and his jewelry store were also great contributors. I'm remembering John Coomer had a hardware store, and he too was very helpful. Oh, goodness, there were so many. And bank officials all took a heavy part in forming the business community.
Once you kind of had the draw of business, to bring more people to the area, how did that change the community? How did you see that changing over time?
Well, it just brought in so many more people that I no longer felt that I knew everybody in Keizer.
Yeah.
When I first started writing for the newspaper, I did. I really knew most everyone in Keizer. But by 1965, that was no longer the case. Sadly, now I don't even know all the streets in Keizer.
So where were like the first subdivisions back then? How did it become a more compact community?
I think Membrane Gardens was one of the most notable, and that was Mankurtz and Brinkley who formed that together, and that was big time uptown stuff. Those houses were all top quality, and it was the place to be if you wanted to be someplace important.
Wow.
And then a few years later, there was Palmacia, and then some developed up off of Verda Lane.
Wow. So you ended up moving away from Keizer in 1970.
Yes.
Correct. To remind me where you took the job up in Seattle and what it was.
Oh, well, I was an industrial editor there. I handled press relations for this insurance company's regional office that covered 5 western states.
Wow.
And it was a lot of fun. Seattle's a great town, too.
Yeah. They have a lot of history there as well.
Yes.
Especially with floods and things of that nature.
Yes.
So you left in 1970, and I think you said you were there for 3 years.
Yes.
And you came back to Salem, correct?
Yes. I came back because I got married again. My husband worked for Oregon State Police.
Okay.
And he was getting somewhere near retirement, so I moved back here. And at that point, my mother still lived on the farm on Spong's Landing Road, and I felt a need to be nearer to her. And besides that, with the new husband, why, that was a pretty good reason for moving back to Keizer.
Right.
Well, only we lived in South Salem, but I kept going back and forth to Keizer to mother a lot.
So when you were in those other places, and you eventually did move back into Keizer proper, too.
Yes.
So what did you see living in Seattle and Salem that made you realize, what Keizer had and drew you back to it?
Oh, it was that sense of community.
Yeah.
I knew that in Keizer, If I had a need, there'd be somebody to at least listen, and they would probably help. But that was not always the case in the bigger cities. They were a little more impersonal there.
Yeah. Was there a particular incident that sticks out in your mind that epitomizes your experience living here and being part of the community in Keizer?
I think it was probably that 1964 flood. We had to move out of the house. The water came up, not inside the interior, but it soaked the interior floors from underneath. And it did a lot of damage to the flooring in our house. But we had to move out. After all, I had children in school and that sort of thing. I had a job, and we all had reasons to move. So the way the community came together, particularly the business community, came together to help those of us who had to evacuate. Somebody found us a place to stay in a sort of motel, but at least it was an empty apartment thing. Somebody else provided basic cooking utensils. Somebody else provided a mat that we could sleep on the floor. And it was pretty hard to get by, but nevertheless, we had the support of the community.
Yeah. How long did it take you to get back in your house after that event?
Oh, about a week.
About a week.
Yeah.
All right. Your daughters also attended the Keizer School, too.
Oh, yes.
What was it like, having gone through there yourself? I mean, I'm sure it doesn't seem as like such a foreign proposition as it does in current day and age when families move so often and so frequently and so far away from each other. Did you enjoy having that continuity?
Oh, very much. And watching the school grow.
Yeah.
When they first began building those classrooms right along River Road, that was when my children were just getting into school. And of course, I was remembering this four classroom building.
Right.
And then they had all of these other rooms and so many more teachers. And Keizer has always had a great luck in getting some of the best teachers in the world. Oh, they have had wonderful teachers.
Cool. I don't know, where are we at?
Go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. So, as far as community events, like how did the community come together in times, aside from emergency situations? What were the things that you guys did? Were football games the big thing that they have been, or
No.
What were the?
I remember a Halloween party that the businessmen staged for kids. And there was, there was a Christmas party. We had Santa Claus come in. And we rented movies and showed cartoons for the kids. And some cookie manufacturing place donated trays and trays and trays of cookies. And so we made punch, and all the business people got together to fund something like that. We had a great time.
Yeah.
And then there were other occasions where we would have a street dance on River Road.
Oh, wow.
Right near the corner of Shamawa and River Road.
Wow.
I don't remember a band. I think it must have been recorded music.
Yeah.
But they started it out with one couple dancing, and then when the music stopped, that couple would go get two more. And nobody was allowed to say, no, I can't dance. If somebody who was dancing asked you to dance, you had to dance. And so everybody did. And before long, we had the street filled with dancing couples.
Oh, wow. So what is, how did things like the World War II affect a place like Keizer? You said you were pulled into work in the canneries to be part of that, but what other ways did it affect the community?
The sudden absence of all the young men. There were there were 8 at least from our dead-end road that went into the service almost immediately. One notable family was the Shannon family. They had 4 sons, and 4 sons went into the service right like that. I believe they were all in the Navy. My brother went into the Air Force. Another young man a little further north went into the Marines. It was awesome. That brings forth another interesting thing. At that point, telephone service was not nearly as available as it is now, and cell phones were unheard of. And we had the only telephone within a mile range. And we would often get calls in the middle of the night. When you're calling from Africa or the Orient or South Pacific or Germany, you call when you can, you know. So we would get calls in the middle of the night, and because we had the only phone, they would call us. Dad would get up and answer the phone. The operator would say, here's a person-to-person call for, say, the Shannon family. Dad would explain that they lived a quarter-mile away, that he would have to go get them. Can you hold? The operator always would say yes. And so they would hold that line open. Dad would get dressed, get into his car, drive down, beat on the Shannon's door, wake them up. They would have to get dressed. Then Dad would drive them back to our place. They would get on the phone. And while it was an annoyance for us, it kept us up to date on where all these kids were, and we were so delighted to do that. And we never locked our door, because people in the neighborhood might need to come in and use the phone. So when we were gone, that door remained unlocked, and the people respected it.
You still get together with a lot of the people that you grew up with, or some of the people that still are around and grew up with in this community. Yes. What is that? How does that keep you connected, and what do you get out of those meetings now?
Oh, we spend a lot of time remembering.
Yeah.
And remembering some of the wonderful things that happened, the Halloween pranks and that sort of thing. Oh my, I really should tell you about the one. We had a big metal gate into our driveway, and then a fence all the way around the rest of the farm. And this one year, my father was growing carrots for stock feed. And he had hired a bunch of the neighborhood kids to come help put those carrots in big gunny sacks. Well, we had a visiting cousin, so Dad thought, well, this Halloween we'd take her into town. We'd go to a movie. First movie we'd gone to for a long time. Well, he was pretty gullible because he didn't anticipate what would happen. But this was Halloween, and it was prank time. And the kids who worked for him got together, rounded up a trailer, loaded up a whole bunch of those 100-pound bags of carrots, filled the trailer, brought them up, took the gate off of the hinges. I don't remember what happened to the gate, but we found it a week later somewhere. And they filled that gate opening with 100-pound bags of carrots. They also put a trailer on the front porch and a tractor on the back porch, and they had a cow tied up somewhere that was ridiculous. I don't recall just where. But those were the days that we had outdoor plumbing. And this visiting cousin had to use that outdoor plumbing. So she went out behind the barn where it was and screamed. They had filled the outdoor outhouse with 100-pound bags of carrots also.
So Jen, tell me a little bit about the crops that you had on your farm and how they evolved over time.
Well, our neighbors had lots of hops. We never grew hops, but other neighbors did. And there were prune orchards and pear orchards around. One of the most interesting was a pear orchard that had been owned by a man named Louis Lockman. He called his place the LL Ranch, and it was along Windsor Island Road, not far from Blake's nursery business, but across the street. When he planted that, he carefully selected every tree in the orchard to be identical to every other tree. Then when they were planted, the first branch had to point to the same direction as every other tree in that orchard. And he had them pruned very carefully every year so that every tree in that orchard, and it was probably 20 acres, every tree was exactly like every other tree in that orchard. And they were planted in perfect rows so that whether you looked this way, or that way, it was all a perfectly straight row. That was the mark of a good farmer. Then in 1937, we had a pretty severe winter. I recall playing in 2.5 feet of snow. And there was also a silver thaw following that. And that just played havoc with that absolutely beautiful pear orchard. Broke the hearts of many more people than Louis Lockman. Everyone was proud of that orchard. Anyway, then eventually the crops changed. We grew lots and lots of strawberries, and that turned out to be my father's main main business. He developed a strawberry planting mechanism and had 3 different crews that would go all over the Willamette Valley planting strawberries. And he had a pretty sizable business going that way. Then a little bit later, he got into seed crops. And there was cabbage seed, cauliflower seed, radish seed. Oh, radish seed has the nicest fragrance when it's in bloom. And there was one year that he grew sugar beet seed. Well, since I was a reporter at that time, I took the opportunity to write up that story. Now, the interesting part about that is that we can grow the sugar beet seed here in the valley, but we couldn't grow the sugar beets if we wanted to. Our climate is too mild. We don't have enough extremes. We don't have a hot enough summer. And we have too cold a winter. Or no, we have a mild winter, and we need a mild winter to grow the sugar beet seed. But we couldn't grow the sugar beets here at all. So they would take the sugar beet seed that came off just 1 acre here in the valley, take it over to the east side of Oregon, where the temperatures were more favorable, plant it as sugar beets. And it would grow into enough sugar beets to create 88,000 pounds of table sugar.
Holy cow.
Isn't that awesome to consider?
That is.
I could never figure how. Of course, being a reporter, I ended up being curious about everything.
Right.
And I could never figure how they could turn an ugly, muddy, smelly thing like a sugar beet into something as pure and pristine as sugar. Finally, within the past year, I got to go back to the sugar manufacturing place. They gave me a private guided tour and showed me how they do that. It was absolutely fascinating. But Dad would plant the sugar beet seed here in August. And by the time the first frost came along in late October or early November, the plants would be about 10 inches high, something like that. And our mild temperature would stunt the plant but not kill it. Where if these same seeds were growing in eastern Oregon, they'd die and never rise again. But here, our gentle winters made it possible for them to just stunt. Then in the spring, when the air and soil warmed, they would sprout and bolt and go into seed stalks. And you can see them almost any summer around here in 10-acre plots about, here and there, with seed stalks growing as high as 6 and 8 feet tall, loaded with sugar beet seed.
After the sugar beets, was there anything else, or was that kind of, did that kind of,
That
you said
was-
you went into seed crops, so
Yeah. He did a lot of seed crops for West Coast beet seed and for other companies doing seed crops of any sort. And there was just a big variety. Our soil there was so good it could grow anything. That brings to mind one more thing. The U.S. Department of Agriculture asked Dad to devote one small field to growing an experimental crop of strawberries. They were known as the Shasta variety. So he planted them, and in the spring they began blossoming, and we knew 6 weeks from blossom to berry. And in 6 weeks we had these beautiful waxy red berries that were, you couldn't resist them. They just looked so picture pretty. But you pick one and you eat it, and it tasted like straw instead of strawberries. They didn't grow that crop anymore. But now we have the wonderful things like Tillamook flavored strawberries that are just perfect. Oh, they are so big and every bit as pretty as the Shasta berries were. And these are sweet.
Jan, thank you so much for joining us here today at the Keizer Oral History Project. We really appreciate your time, and we've loved your stories.
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege, and I'm glad that those stories will continue when I'm not here.
All right, well, you have a good day.
You too. God bless Keizer.